The fluorescent lights of the hospital room hummed a monotonous dirge, a soundtrack for the end of my life. They flickered over Dr. Evans's face, making his expression of practiced sympathy look ghoulish. He was a man paid to deliver death sentences with a gentle bedside manner. He told us my kidneys had failed. Not were failing, but had failed. The past tense was a closed door. He spoke of dialysis as a bridge, not a destination, and mentioned that without a transplant, the bridge would lead off a cliff in a matter of months. My mother Helen sat beside my bed, her body shrinking with every word he spoke. She was a woman carved from the hardships of Warren, Ohio, a town that, much like my own body, was rusting from the inside out. Her hands, calloused from a lifetime of work that never paid enough, were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury her generation couldn't afford. Instead, she just seemed to crumble the strong lines of her face, softening into a mask of pure, silent despair. I felt nothing, or rather, I felt a strange, hollow calm. This wasn't a shock, it was a confirmation. For years, I had felt my body betraying me, a slow, grinding decline that mirrored the shuttered factories and abandoned storefronts of my hometown. The fatigue had become a lead blanket I couldn't throw off, the constant nausea, a bitter companion. The diagnosis was just giving a name to the ghost that had been haunting me. I was 32 years old and my life a series of dead-end jobs and broken dreams was being foreclosed on. My mother finally found her voice a dry whisper. She asked the doctor about family donors. She wanted to know if she could be tested. Doctor. Evans gave her a sad, patient smile and explained that her age and her own health issues would likely disqualify her. His gaze then shifted to me, a silent, probing question. He asked if I had any siblings. And there it was. The name that hung in the air between us, unspoken but deafening. Caleb. My mother's head snapped up, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in her tired eyes. Of course. Caleb. The golden child, the perfect son. The one who had escaped. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number that connected our world of decay to his world of glass and steel in Chicago. I watched her, a bitter taste rising in my throat. I knew what she was thinking. Caleb would fix this. Caleb, with his successful architecture firm, his tailored suits, and his perfectly curated life, would swoop in and play the hero just as he always had. He would save his screw-up younger brother and in doing so would polish his own halo a little brighter. The wait for his arrival was a special kind of hell. My mother paced the small room. Her anxiety a palpable force, occasionally smoothing my blanket or adjusting my pillow with a touch that felt more like a plea than a comfort. She spoke of Caleb's impending arrival as if it were the second coming. She told me he had dropped everything, a major project, a meeting with an important client, all for me. I was supposed to be grateful. All I felt was the familiar, coiling resentment. He arrived the next morning. The door to my room swung open, and for a moment the sterile antiseptic air was replaced by the scent of expensive cologne and the crisp, clean air of another city. Caleb stood there, his long wool coat draped perfectly over his shoulders, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. He was the picture of success, his features sharp and handsome, untouched by the grime and struggle that had defined my life. He looked at me lying amidst the tangle of tubes and wires, and I saw it in his eyes. Not love, not fear, but a flicker of pity. The kind of pity a man feels when looking at a stray dog on the side of the road. He embraced my mother, who clung to him as if he were a life raft. He told her not to worry, that everything would be okay. He promised her he would do whatever it took. His voice was smooth, confident, the voice of a man accustomed to getting what he wants. He then turned to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt heavy, proprietary. He told me to hang in there, that he was here now. He said we were brothers and we would get through this together. It was a performance and he was a master actor. I almost had to admire the artistry of it. The next 24 hours were a blur of medical jargon and forced family pleasantries. Caleb was whisked away for a battery of tests. He was a model of cooperative efficiency, charming the nurses and impressing the doctors with his calm demeanor. While he was gone, my mother sat by my bed, her conversation a constant hymn of praise for her firstborn. She recounted stories of his generosity, his intelligence, his unwavering sense of duty. Each word was a small, sharp jab, a reminder of the chasm that had always existed between us. She wasn't just praising him, she was justifying the unspoken hierarchy of our family, the one where he was the investment and I was the liability. I listened, my silence, a wall she couldn't penetrate. I thought about the 15 years that had passed since the night that had shattered my world and set his on a golden trajectory. 15 years I had spent living in the shadow of a single catastrophic moment. 15 years he had spent running from it, building a new life on a foundation of lies. And now he was back, not out of love, but out of obligation. His perfect life had been inconvenienced by my dying body, and he was here to fix the problem so he could return to it conscience clear. The call came the following afternoon. My mother, Caleb, and I were all in my room when his phone buzzed. It was Dr. Evans. Caleb put it on speaker, a gesture of transparent inclusivity. The doctor's voice was clinical, but I could hear an undercurrent of something that sounded like relief. He delivered the news with professional satisfaction. The tests were back. The tissue, typing, the blood work, the cross-matching, everything was, in his words, a perfect match. He said it was as ideal a donor situation as they could have ever hoped for. A strangled sob escaped my mother's lips. She threw her arms around Caleb, her body shaking with a wave of relief so powerful it seemed to physically hurt her. She wept into his expensive coat, her words muffled but clear. She called him her savior, her angel. She told him she knew he would be the one. Caleb held her, patting her back with a practiced, soothing rhythm. Over her shoulder, his eyes met mine. And in that moment, I saw past the performance. I saw the truth. It wasn't the joy of saving his brother that lit his face. It was the profound, selfish relief of a man who had just been absolved. He had been given a chance to erase the guilt, to finally truly pay off his debt with a piece of his own flesh. By giving me a kidney, he wouldn't just be saving my life, he would be liberating his own. He would be the hero of the story, the magnanimous brother who sacrificed a part of himself for his less fortunate sibling. The past would be wiped clean. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. For 15 years, I had carried the weight of his sin. I had borne the consequences, lived with the shattered pieces of my future while he built a monument to his own success. I had watched him become the man I was supposed to be. And now he thought he could buy his redemption with a simple surgical procedure. He thought he could cut the cancer of his guilt out of his own body and implant it into mine disguised as a gift. My mother finally pulled away her face, blotchy but radiant with joy. She turned to me, her smile wider than I had seen it in years. She told me it was a miracle. A true miracle. Caleb approached my bed, his own smile now firmly in place. It was a victor's smile. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the same spot where my mother had sat in despair just a day before. He looked me in the eye, his voice soft, almost conspiratorial. He told me he had been so scared, but now he knew it was all meant to be. He told me that in a few weeks we'd both be on our feet, and this would all be a bad memory. He said this was a new start for us. I let him finish. I let the silence stretch out, savoring the look of hopeful anticipation on his face. He was waiting for my gratitude. He was waiting for me to break down, to thank him, to complete the scene he had written in his head. I took a shallow breath, the air rattling in my chest. I looked from his expectant face to my mother, who was watching us with tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for, not for days, but for 15 years. It was the only weapon I had left, and I was going to use it to shatter his perfect world. I turned my head slowly back to Caleb, making sure I had his full, undivided attention. I made my voice as steady and as cold as I could. I told him I wouldn't be taking his kidney. The smile on his face didn't fall. It froze. It was as if his facial muscles had locked in place, unable to process the information. He let out a small, confused laugh. He asked me what I was talking about. He told me not to joke around, that this wasn't the time. My mother's joy vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp fear. She asked me what was wrong, why I would say such a thing. I ignored her. My focus was entirely on Caleb. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was not joking. I told him I would rather die, that I would rather let every organ in my body shut down and rot from the inside out than have a single piece of him living inside me. I told him that his charity was not welcome here. I told him that this wasn't a gift he was allowed to give. This was a debt, a blood debt, and he wasn't getting off that easily. The price for what he did to me wasn't a kidney. The price was my life, and I was going to make damn sure he watched me pay it. He just stared, his mouth slightly agape. The mask was gone. For the first time in 15 years, I saw the real Caleb. Not the architect, not the perfect son, but the scared, guilty boy from that rainy night. He was utterly, completely, and beautifully broken. And in the humming silence of that hospital room, my revenge had finally begun. The silence that followed my declaration was a living thing. It filled the room thick and suffocating, pressing down on us with a weight far heavier than the sterile hospital air. My mother's face, which had been a portrait of ecstatic relief moments before, collapsed into a mask of horrified disbelief. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that was half sob, half protest. Caleb just sat there frozen on the edge of my bed. The confident, composed architect from Chicago was gone. In his place was a man whose carefully constructed world had just been hit by a wrecking ball. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a confusion so profound it bordered on panic. He stammered that I must be confused, that perhaps the medication was affecting my judgment. He suggested that we could talk about this later after I had rested. He was trying to regain control, to put my words into a neat little box labeled temporary insanity, so he could manage it, solve it, and dispose of it. But I would not be managed. I held his gaze, my own resolve as hard and unyielding as the cheap linoleum floor. I told him my mind had never been clearer. I told him that for the first time in 15 years I was the one making the decisions. My mother found her voice then, a ragged, pleading shriek. She rushed to my bedside, her hands fluttering near my face as if she wanted to touch me but was afraid of what she might find. She begged me to tell her what was wrong. She asked why I would do this to Caleb, to her, to myself. She said that this was a gift from God, a second chance, and I was throwing it away out of some misplaced pride or anger. Her words were a torrent of love and fear all twisted together. She looked at Caleb, who was still pale and silent, and then back at me, her eyes screaming a question she couldn't bring herself to ask. How could you be so cruel? That was when the anger, cold and pure, finally broke through my calm. I told her this had nothing to do with God and everything to do with him. I pointed a trembling finger at Caleb. I told her to ask him about debts, ask him about the price of a life. Caleb flinched as if I had physically struck him. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He told our mother that I wasn't well, that he would go find the doctor. It was his classic move when confronted with an emotional truth he couldn't handle. He retreated into the safety of logistics and authority figures. He needed someone in a white coat to validate his narrative that I was the one who was broken. I told him not to bother. I told them both to get out. The words hung in the air, brutal and final. My mother began to weep openly now, her shoulders shaking. She whispered my name, Leo, as if it were a prayer that had gone unanswered. Caleb took her gently by the arm and led her towards the door. He didn't look at me again. But just before he stepped out, he paused, his back still to me. He told me, his voice low and strained, that he didn't know what game I was playing, but that he would not let me die. Then they were gone. The door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back in was different. It was my silence. Mine to own, mine to fill. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound, a steady electronic drumbeat counting down the seconds I had left. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness, the ghosts I had kept at bay for so long came rushing in. The scent of the hospital, that cloying mixture of bleach and sickness, faded away, replaced by the smell of damp earth and cut grass. The monotonous beep of the monitor became the rhythmic thud of running shoes on a cinder track. I was 17 again. My body was not this frail, useless prison of flesh and failing organs. It was a perfectly tuned engine of muscle and bone. I could feel the power coiling in my legs, the burn in my lungs, a welcome fire, not a sign of collapse. I was the star of the Warren High School track team. Not just a star. I was a phenomenon. My event was the 800 meters, 2 laps of controlled violence, a sprint that required the endurance of a marathoner, and I was born for it. I remembered the feeling of the final 100 meters when my body screamed for me to stop, but my mind pushed through the pain. I could feel the wind on my face, hear the roar of the small crowd in the bleachers, see the blurred figure of my father by the finish line, his stopwatch in hand, a rare, proud smile on his face. He was a factory man, a man of few words and even fewer compliments, but on the track I could feel his approval. He saw the same fire in me that had once burned in him before the factory had ground it down to embers. Caleb was there too, always. He'd be in the stands, usually with a book, looking bored. He was 2 years older, smarter in the way that schools measured it, with a quick, sarcastic wit that he used as both a shield and a weapon. He found my dedication to running to be quaint. He told me once that I was spending my youth running in circles, that there was a whole world outside of Warren, and I was too busy looking at my own feet to see it. There was a truth to it, but it was a truth coated in jealousy. While I was earning medals and the quiet respect of our father, Caleb was earning detention slips and the worried glances of our mother. He was restless, a coiled spring of intellectual energy with no outlet in our small town. He saw my success not as my own achievement but as a reflection of his own perceived failures. He was supposed to be the brilliant one, the one destined for great things. Yet here I was, the jock, the one with a clear path out, with college scouts from Ohio State and Michigan calling the house. One memory, sharp and painful, cut through the rest. It was the evening after I had broken the regional record. The local paper had a picture of me crossing the finish line, my face a mask of agony and triumph. My father had framed it and put it on the mantelpiece right next to Caleb's academic awards. That night I found Caleb in the garage smoking a stolen cigarette. He had the newspaper clipping in his hand. He didn't congratulate me. He just looked at the picture and told me it must be nice. He said it must be so simple to just run, to have everyone know exactly what you're good at. He said that some people had to think, to plan, to fight their way out of this town with their minds, while others could just do it with their legs. The bitterness in his voice was so potent it felt like I could taste it. I didn't understand it then. I just felt defensive. I told him he didn't know how hard I worked, how much I sacrificed. We argued the way brothers do, our words sharp and clumsy. But looking back now from the sterile vantage point of my deathbed, I could see it all so clearly. He wasn't just jealous of my running. He was terrified by it. My success highlighted the pressure he felt. Every medal I won was another stone on the pile of expectations he carried on his shoulders. He was the smart one, the one who was supposed to save us all, and he didn't know how. So he lashed out, his intellect curdling into cynicism. The beep of the heart monitor pulled me back to the present. The ghost of the track faded, leaving behind the dull ache of loss. That boy, the one with lightning in his legs and a future as wide open as the sky, was dead. He had died 15 years ago on a rain-slicked stretch of asphalt on Route 422. Caleb had been the one behind the wheel, but I was the one who had been buried in the wreckage. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It opened slowly and Caleb stepped inside, alone this time. He had taken off his coat. He looked smaller, diminished. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, uncertain posture. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a long moment, as if trying to figure out the first move in a chess game where all his pieces had been swept off the board. He finally spoke, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier performative concern. He asked me what I wanted. He said if it was money, he would give me anything. He told me he could set me up for life, buy me a house anywhere, ensure I never had to worry about anything again. I almost laughed. It was so perfectly him. Even now he thought this was a transaction. He believed that the wound I carried could be healed with a checkbook. He was still trying to buy his way out of the past. I shook my head slowly on the pillow. I told him his money was worthless here. I told him it was just paper stained with his guilt and I didn't want it. He took a step closer to the bed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He asked, his voice cracking with a desperation he could no longer hide, what this was all about. He insisted the accident was a long time ago. He said we were just kids. He told me he had lived with what happened every single day of his life. He tried to sell me his pain, to make me believe that his guilt was a punishment equal to my loss. Every word he spoke was like gasoline on a fire I had been nursing for over a decade. He lived with it. I looked at my atrophied legs hidden beneath the thin hospital blanket. These were the legs that were supposed to carry me to a state championship, to a college education, to a life beyond the smokestacks of Warren. Now they could barely carry me to the bathroom. I told him he didn't live with it. He ran from it. He ran all the way to Chicago, to a fancy office in a skyscraper, and built a wall of money and success around himself so he would never have to look back. I was the one who had to live with it. I lived with it every time I woke up in the morning and my leg ached with the memory of shattered bone. I lived with it every time I saw an old friend who asked me what I was up to these days, their eyes full of pity. I lived with it in the silence of our father, who could never look at me the same way again because all he saw was a broken promise. I could see my words hitting him, each one a physical blow. He sank into the visitor's chair, burying his face in his hands. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the beeping of the machine that was measuring the slow, steady rhythm of my own decay. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. He looked utterly defeated. He told me he was sorry. He said he knew those words were not enough, but that he was truly deeply sorry for what he took from me. He then looked right at me and made his final plea. He begged me to let him do this one thing. Let him save my life. He said that maybe it wouldn't make things right, but it would be a start. He asked me for our mother's sake to just let him do this. His appeal to our mother was a low blow and he knew it, but I was ready for it. I had spent 15 years thinking about this moment, about what I would say, what I would do if I ever had him where I wanted him. I told him I would not give him the peace he craved. I told him that his apology was 15 years too late. I told him that saving my life now wouldn't be a start, it would be an ending. It would be the neat, tidy conclusion to his story of redemption. The brother who made a mistake in his youth finally atones by making the ultimate sacrifice. I told him I would not be his happy ending. I would be his ghost. I would haunt him not with my life but with my death. I wanted him to carry the weight of my last gasping breaths for the rest of his miserable, successful life. I wanted him to know that he had been a perfect match, that he held the key to my survival in his own body, and that I chose to die rather than accept anything from him. I told him, my voice dropping to a whisper, that this was my revenge. It was the only thing I had left to take from him, and I was going to enjoy it. He stared at me, all the color drained from his face. There was no anger left, no desperation, only a hollow, dawning horror. He had finally understood. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a sentencing. And I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. He stood up without another word and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the ghosts, the beeping machine, and the cold, sweet satisfaction of a revenge that was just beginning. The quiet that Caleb left behind was different from the silence before. It was not empty. It was charged, vibrating with the fallout of my decision. The beeping of the monitor seemed louder now, each pulse a confirmation of the choice I had made. I was a dead man walking, and for the first time in 15 years I was the one setting the pace. My solitude was short-lived. A nurse, a cheerful woman named Brenda, whose smile never quite reached her eyes, bustled in to prepare me for my first dialysis session. She spoke in the practiced, condescendingly bright tone reserved for the terminally ill and the very young. She told me to think of it as a deep cleaning for my blood, a little spa day for my insides. I watched her lay out the equipment, the clear tubes, the gleaming needles, the intimidating bulk of the machine that would now serve as my external mechanical life support. Each piece of sterile metal and plastic was a testament to my body's utter failure. This was not a spa day. This was a tether. This was the physical manifestation of my helplessness, a 3 times a week, 4-hour-long reminder that I was no longer a self-sufficient human being. I was a faulty piece of machinery that needed to be periodically serviced to keep from breaking down completely. The suffering had begun its next, more intimate phase. The insertion of the needles into the fistula in my arm was a sharp, biting pain, but it was nothing compared to the violation of what came next. I watched, morbidly fascinated, as my own dark, toxic blood was drawn out of my body, snaking through the clear tubes into the machine. I could see it circulating outside of me, being processed by a humming, whirring box that was doing the job my own flesh and blood had abandoned. A profound, soul-deep exhaustion washed over me, a weariness that went beyond the physical. The machine was drinking my life force, and I could feel myself diminishing with every pump and whir. It was during this state of enforced stillness, tethered to my mechanical kidney, that my mother returned. She was no longer the pleading, weeping woman from before. The fear had burned away, leaving behind the hard, unyielding core of a desperate mother's rage. Her face was pale and set, her eyes narrowed to slits. She stood at the foot of my bed, her hands gripping the metal rail so tightly her knuckles looked like pebbles of bone. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke in a low, seething tone that was far more terrifying than any scream. She asked me if I was proud of myself. She wanted to know if this was what I wanted to see her son, her other son, broken and hollowed out with guilt. She accused me of being a monster, of taking Caleb's love and twisting it into a weapon. She told me that I was so consumed by the past that I was willing to burn down the entire family just to feel the warmth of the flames. She reminded me of all the things Caleb had done for them, for her, after my father passed. How he paid the mortgage on the house, how he made sure she never had to worry about bills. She painted him as a saint, and I, the devil, luxuriating in his own self-pity. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow. Part of me, the small, scared part that still craved her approval, recoiled in pain. The dialysis machine hummed, my blood flowed, and my mother's words flayed the skin from my soul. The suffering was immense, a perfect storm of physical decay and emotional torment. I was at my lowest point, a prisoner in my own body and in this room. And then I thought of Caleb's face when I had refused him. That perfect mask of control shattering into a million pieces. I remembered the dawning horror in his eyes as he finally understood that his money and his charm were useless here. The memory was a balm. It was a cool, soothing hand on the burning wound of my mother's accusations. The satisfaction began to trickle in, slow and steady, like an IV drip. It pushed back against the pain. I realized she was only this angry because my plan was working. Caleb had gone to her desperate, and she was now his unwilling soldier sent to fight a battle he knew he couldn't win. My refusal was not just hurting him. It was making him show his true manipulative colors. My mother's rant crescendoed. She tearfully asked me what had happened to my heart, what had turned me so cold. The question meant to break me instead threw me back in time. The humming of the machine faded, and I was in another hospital 15 years ago. The smell of antiseptic was the same, but I wasn't the one in the bed. I was in a wheelchair, a heavy cast encasing my leg from thigh to ankle. My father was pushing me down a long, polished corridor. We were going to see a specialist, the best orthopedic surgeon in Cleveland. It was 3 months after the accident. The surgeon was a kind man with tired eyes who spoke in gentle but firm finalities. He had my x-rays clipped to a light box on the wall, a ghostly map of my shattered tibia and fibula. He pointed out the pins and plates holding me together. He explained that the surgery had been a success, that I would walk again, likely with a permanent limp. But then he delivered the final verdict. He told me with that same practiced sympathy, Dr. Evans had used, that my career as a competitive runner was over. The complex network of muscle, tendon, and bone had sustained too much trauma. I would never again have the explosive power or the resilience needed for the 800 meters. I remember staring at the x-ray, at the spider web of fractures in the bone. It wasn't just my leg that had been shattered on that road. It was my identity. Everything I was, everything I was going to be, was tied to the strength and speed of my legs. Without that, who was I? My father didn't say a word on the long drive home. He just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. When we got back, I saw him go to the mantelpiece. He took down the framed newspaper clipping of me crossing the finish line and put it away in a drawer. He never mentioned my running again. It was as if that part of my life, the only part he had ever truly been proud of, had been erased. The silence from him was a heavier sentence than the doctor's words. My mother, on the other hand, told everyone how lucky we were. Lucky that I was alive. Lucky that Caleb had walked away with just a few scratches. She repeated the lie we had all agreed to, telling friends and family how I had lost control of the car on the wet road. She never wavered. She chose her brilliant, promising son's future over my broken one without a moment's hesitation. The memory ended, and I was back in the dialysis chair. My mother was still waiting for an answer, her face a mess of tears and fury. I looked at her, and the pain she was causing me now seemed insignificant, a pale echo of the agony she had unknowingly inflicted for years. I felt a surge of cold power. The suffering was a mountain, but the satisfaction of my revenge was the pickaxe that would bring it down one chip at a time. I told her, my voice hoarse from disuse, that Caleb had turned me cold. I told her that on the night he destroyed my future, he had also killed the part of me that knew how to forgive. I then looked at the dialysis machine, at my blood flowing through its veins, and told her that this was the life she had chosen for me when she chose to protect his lie. She recoiled as if I had burned her with a hot iron. She had no answer. She just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing before she turned and fled the room. Victory. It was a bitter, ugly taste, but it was undeniably sweet. The pain in my arm from the needles lessened. The profound exhaustion felt more like a peaceful emptiness. I had survived her attack. I had turned her guilt back on her. 1 point for the dying man. The next day, Caleb tried a new tactic. He returned, but he wasn't alone. He brought Dr. Evans with him. It was a transparent, pathetic maneuver. The two of them stood by my bed, Caleb looking anxious, the doctor looking professionally concerned. Caleb did most of the talking. He told the doctor that he was deeply worried about my mental state. He mentioned my aggression and my irrational decision-making. He delicately suggested that my uremic poisoning might be causing confusion, that I wasn't competent to make life or death decisions for myself. He was trying to strip me of my last shred of autonomy. He was trying to have me declared insane so he could force his gift upon me. The rage I felt was a clean, white-hot flame. It burned away the last of my fear. This was the ultimate insult. After taking my legs, my future, and my identity, he now wanted to take my mind, but I did not shout. I did not rage. I looked calmly at Dr. Evans. I asked him if, in his medical opinion, I seemed confused. I discussed my diagnosis with him using the correct terminology I had learned from my own research. I explained the function of dialysis and the statistical probabilities of transplant success and rejection. I spoke calmly and rationally. Then I turned my attention to Caleb. I asked the doctor if it was common for a family member, particularly one who might be feeling a tremendous amount of long-held guilt, to try and override a patient's wishes for their own emotional relief. I laid it out not as an accusation but as a clinical query. I painted Caleb not as a concerned brother but as a compromised party acting out of his own selfish need for absolution. Dr. Evans looked from me to Caleb and I saw the shift in his eyes. He was a man of science and ethics. He saw a lucid patient making a clear, albeit tragic, choice. And he saw a family member trying to manipulate the situation. He turned to Caleb and told him in a firm but polite tone that while my choice was unfortunate, I was clearly of sound mind and that my wishes as the patient were paramount. He told Caleb the hospital would not and could not force me to undergo any procedure against my will. Caleb's face crumpled. He had played his trump card and it had been rejected. He had tried to use the system against me and I had turned the system against him. He looked at me and in his eyes I saw not just defeat but fear. He was starting to realize that he had no moves left. He was trapped in a game where the only winning move was one I would never allow him to make. He and the doctor left. I lay back against the pillows, the physical weakness from the dialysis, a stark contrast to the immense soaring feeling of power that coursed through me. The peak of my suffering under the weight of the machine and my mother's fury had been agonizing. But this victory, this moment of stripping Caleb of his power in front of an authority figure, was not just satisfying. It was euphoric. It was the first real payment on a debt 15 years overdue, and I knew with a certainty that warmed my cold blood that I was going to collect it in full. The days that followed settled into a grim routine, a three-act play of suffering performed on a loop. Act 1, the dialysis. Tethered to the humming machine, feeling my life being siphoned out and pumped back in a pale imitation of vitality. Act 2, the exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness that came after, where even lifting my head felt like a monumental effort. Act 3, the waiting. Lying in the sterile silence, feeling the toxins slowly build back up in my blood, a prelude to the next performance. My body was a battlefield and I was losing. The nurses would come in with their forced cheerfulness talking about my numbers, but I could see the truth in the slight tightening of their smiles. I was on a downward trajectory. But as my physical world shrank to the dimensions of this hospital bed, my mind, sharpened by anger and a singular purpose, expanded. The pain, the weakness, the constant nausea, they were no longer just symptoms of my disease. They were tools. They were the components of my masterpiece of revenge. Caleb and my mother had retreated. They still visited, but their approach had changed. The emotional onslaughts and manipulative ploys were gone, replaced by a tense, hovering anxiety. They would sit in the visitor's chair making awkward small talk about the weather or something they saw on the news. They were waiting for me to break. They thought my suffering would eventually grind me down, that the sheer animal instinct to survive would overwhelm my desire for vengeance. They were wrong. They saw my physical decay and mistook it for a weakening of will. In reality, every pang of pain, every wave of sickness was simply forging my resolve into something harder, something unbreakable. My plan had always been simple in its objective: to make Caleb suffer. But a simple refusal to accept his kidney was a blunt instrument. It was effective, but it lacked artistry. I wanted to dismantle him piece by piece, to strip him of the armor he had spent 15 years building. His success, his reputation, his self-perception as the good son. I needed to turn his own life into a weapon against him. I needed to move from defense to offense. My first move required an agent in the outside world. I used my one phone call of the day not to speak to family but to an old name from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Mark Renshaw. In high school, Mark had been a scrawny, brilliant kid on the debate team, the kind of guy Caleb would have dismissed with a sarcastic remark. Mark had been one of the few who had seen me as more than just a runner. Now he was a small-time lawyer in Warren, with an office in a dusty building downtown. He was exactly what I needed: smart, local, and someone who remembered who I used to be. When he arrived at the hospital the next day, he looked older, his face etched with the weariness of a man who spends his days fighting losing battles for people with no money. But when he saw me lying amidst the tubes, I saw a flicker of the old sharp intelligence in his eyes. He didn't offer pity. He simply asked me what I needed. I told him I wanted to make a sworn affidavit. I told him I wanted to set the record straight about an event that had happened 15 years ago. As I spoke, his professional demeanor cracked. He remembered the accident. Everyone in town did. The story of the rising sports star whose career ended in a wreck was a local legend. He listened, his pen still, as I laid out the truth for the first time to anyone. I told him about Caleb driving, about the drinking, about the panicked plea in the wreckage, and about my decision to take the fall. I told him how my mother and father had sanctioned the lie to protect Caleb's future. I watched his face as the story unfolded, saw the dawning comprehension, the anger on my behalf. When I was finished, the room was silent except for the ever-present beep of the monitor. He looked at me, his expression grim. He told me that what I was describing was a criminal conspiracy, a perversion of justice. I told him I didn't care about justice. Justice was a fantasy. I cared about leverage. I instructed him to draft the affidavit in the strongest possible legal language. It was to be my official dying declaration. He was to hold it sealed and was only to release it upon my death. And he wasn't to release it to the police. He was to send certified copies to the Ohio State Bar Association, to the board of directors of Caleb's architectural firm in Chicago, and to the editor of the Chicago Tribune. Mark understood immediately. This wasn't about sending Caleb to jail. It was about utterly destroying his professional life and public reputation. It was a posthumous bomb designed to detonate at the heart of everything he had built. Mark agreed without hesitation. He told me he would draft it immediately and would consider it the most important case of his career pro bono. As he left, I felt the first true surge of power. The first piece of my offensive strategy was in place. The satisfaction was a warm current in my cold veins, more potent than any painkiller. With the affidavit secured, it was time for the next phase, a psychological assault. I knew Caleb was getting daily updates on my condition from the nurses. I decided to give him a show. For 2 days, I forced myself to rally. When he and my mother visited, I sat up. I ate a little of the hospital food, choking it down. I engaged in their meaningless small talk, offering weak but present responses. I let them see a flicker of the old Leo. It worked perfectly. I saw the desperate hope ignite in their eyes. They mistook my performance for a sign that I was reconsidering, that my will was finally failing. My mother's hands became less frantic, her voice softer. Caleb started talking about the future, about a small lake house he could buy where I could recover after the surgery. He was already writing the happy ending to his story. On the 3rd day, I pulled the rug out from under them. When they arrived, I was seemingly unresponsive. The nurses were hovering, my vital signs on the monitor were erratic. I had timed it, refusing food and water since the middle of the night to ensure I was at my weakest. I let them see me at the edge of the abyss. The whiplash of hope to despair was a visible shock to their systems. My mother crumbled her face, a mess of tears. Caleb just stood there, his face ashen, looking at the beeping machine as if he could will the numbers to improve. That evening, when I was stable again, he came back alone. This was what I had been waiting for. He was broken, terrified, and desperate. He stood over my bed and told me he couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't just sit and watch me die. He begged me, his voice raw, to just tell him what I wanted. He told me again that anything he had was mine. I opened my eyes and looked at him. My voice was a dry rasp, but my words were as sharp as a scalpel. I told him that I might reconsider. I let the words hang in the air, let him feel the sudden intoxicating rush of possibility. He leaned in closer, his eyes wide. He asked what it would take. This was the moment. The culmination of my planning. I told him it was simple. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his apologies. I wanted the truth, but I didn't want to hear it from him. I wanted our mother to hear it. From him, he looked confused. I clarified the terms with cold, deliberate precision. I told him I wanted the 3 of us in this room, and I wanted him to look our mother in the eye and tell her the full and complete story of what happened that night. I wanted him to confess that he was the one driving drunk. I wanted him to admit that he begged me to lie for him. And I wanted him to acknowledge that his entire life, his entire success, was built on the foundation of that lie, a lie that had cost me everything. I told him that if he could do that, if he could tear down the false idol she had worshipped for 15 years with his own 2 hands, then I would think about accepting his kidney. The color drained from his face. He finally saw the trap. His entire identity, especially in our mother's eyes, was that of the responsible, successful son who looked after his family. He was the saint, the savior. For him to confess the truth to her would be to destroy the very core of his being. He would have to admit that he was not the hero of our family's story, but the villain. It was a demand more intimate and more devastating than any amount of money or any public humiliation. It was an act of psychological self-immolation. He sputtered that he couldn't do that to her, that the truth would destroy her. I gave him a faint, cruel smile. I told him that was the price. His comfort or my life. The choice was his. He had until the next day to decide. Then I closed my eyes, a clear dismissal. He stood there for what felt like an eternity before turning and walking out of the room, a man being led to his own execution. I lay in the darkness, my body weak and failing, but my mind soaring. The board was set. The final checkmate was in sight. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I refused all visitors, even the nurses, unless it was absolutely necessary. I needed the silence. I needed to gather what little strength I had for the final act. Each beep of the monitor felt like a tick of a clock counting down to a detonation. I didn't know what Caleb would do. I had constructed a perfect, inescapable trap, a choice between two impossibilities. He could either let me die, cementing his guilt for eternity, or he could destroy the one relationship that seemed to validate his entire existence, his status as the revered son in our mother's eyes. I had forced him to choose which part of his soul he was willing to sacrifice. Lying there, I felt a strange detachment from my own body. The pain and nausea were distant, a static hum in the background. My entire being was focused on that evening, on the confrontation I had engineered. This was more than just revenge for a ruined leg or a lost future. This was about truth. A truth that had been buried for 15 years, festering like a poison in the foundation of our family. Tonight I would lance the wound. He arrived at 7 o'clock, just as the evening light began to fade, casting long, somber shadows across my room. He didn't come alone. My mother followed a few steps behind him, her face a mixture of confusion and fragile hope. I could see that he had told her nothing, only that I had agreed to talk. She was clinging to the belief that this was the moment of my surrender, the moment her prayers would be answered. Her ignorance was a crucial part of the spectacle I had planned. They took their seats in the two visitor chairs, arranging them to face my bed as if they were an audience awaiting a performance. And in a way they were. Caleb looked terrible. His expensive clothes were rumpled, his face was pale and unshaven, and dark circles pooled beneath his eyes. He had the haunted look of a man who had wrestled with demons all night and lost. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Instead, he stared at his hands, which were clenched together so tightly they looked like they were carved from stone. My mother, sensing the tension, tried to fill the silence. Her voice was bright, artificial. She started talking about the nurses, how kind they had been. She mentioned a new treatment she had read about online. She was building a pathetic little dam of small talk against the tidal wave she didn't know was coming. I let her speak for a few moments before I cut her off. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through her chatter like a razor. I told her I was glad she was here. I told her there was something Caleb needed to say to her. She looked at Caleb, a hopeful smile on her face. Caleb, she prompted, expecting him to announce that I had come to my senses. This was it. The moment of truth. Caleb slowly raised his head, and his eyes, when they finally met mine, were a landscape of utter despair. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod, the executioner signaling the condemned. He turned to our mother. He opened his mouth, but for a second no sound came out. A dry, rasping noise was all he could manage. He swallowed hard, gathering himself, and then he began to speak. His voice was a monotone, a flat, lifeless sound, as if he were reading a legal document detailing his own ruin. He told her about that night. Not the sanitized, agreed-upon lie we had all lived with, but the real, ugly, unvarnished truth. He started with the party, the cheap beer he and his friends had been drinking. He described stealing our father's car keys, the feeling of reckless power as he sped down the back roads. He talked about picking me up after my late track practice, how I had told him he was driving too fast, how he had laughed it off full of drunken arrogance. My mother's smile began to falter. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. She started to interrupt, to say that wasn't how it happened, that I had been driving. Caleb didn't let her. He raised his voice slightly, a tremor of agony running through it, and kept going. He described the moment of impact with terrifying clarity, the screech of the tires on the wet pavement, the sickening crunch of metal, the world tumbling in a chaotic blur of shattered glass and darkness. He spoke of the moment of consciousness afterward, the smell of gasoline and rain, the eerie silence broken only by my groans of pain. And then he came to the heart of it. He looked directly at our mother, his eyes pleading for an absolution he knew he would not receive, and he confessed. He told her how he had crawled over to me in the wreckage, how he had seen my leg bent at an unnatural angle, and how in that moment of pure selfish terror his only thought had been of himself, of his future, of the colleges he'd applied to, of the life he was supposed to have. He told her how he had begged me. He repeated the words he had used that night, his voice cracking. "Please, Leo. Tell them you were driving. Please. It'll ruin me. They won't care about you, you're just a jock. But it'll kill me, please." A strangled sound escaped my mother's throat. Her face had gone completely white, a bloodless mask of shock. She was no longer just confused. She was beginning to understand, and the understanding was a horror. Caleb, now lost in the torrent of his confession, couldn't stop. He told her how I had agreed, how even in my agony I had protected him, and then he delivered the final devastating blow. He confessed how he had stood by and let our parents let her reinforce the lie. He admitted that he had watched silent and complicit as my future was erased, as I became the town screw-up, the boy who threw it all away while he went off to college, his path cleared by my sacrifice. He finished, and the silence that fell was absolute. It was a dead silence devoid of even the comforting beep of the monitor, which suddenly seemed to have stopped. My mother did not move. She did not speak. She simply stared at Caleb, her firstborn, her golden child. Her face was a blank slate, as if the truth had been so catastrophic it had wiped away every emotion, every expression she had ever known. She looked like a statue carved from salt. I watched her, feeling a cold, clinical detachment. I had expected tears, screams, accusations. This was worse. This was the silent, complete death of an entire lifetime of belief. She wasn't just learning that her son was a liar. She was learning that she had been a willing accomplice in the destruction of her other son. Her entire moral universe had just collapsed. The love and pride she had felt for Caleb were now revealed to be built on a foundation of deceit and my suffering. Caleb, his confession finally spent, seemed to shrink. He sat there, his shoulders slumped, a man hollowed out from the inside. He slowly turned his gaze from our mother to me. There was no defiance left, no hope. Only the vacant stare of a man who had just set fire to his own world and was now waiting for the ashes to settle. Finally, my mother moved. It was a slow, robotic gesture. She stood up from her chair. She did not look at Caleb again. She did not look at me. She stared at the wall straight ahead, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She walked out of the room without a word, her footsteps unnervingly steady. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me and Caleb alone in the ruins. He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a terrible, pleading question. He had done what I asked. He had paid the price. Now he wanted to know if it was enough. I looked at this broken man, this betrayer who had finally been brought to his knees. The surge of satisfaction I expected to feel was there, but it was different than before. It wasn't the hot, euphoric rush of victory. It was a cold, quiet, and deeply profound sense of completion. It was the feeling of a heavy weight, one I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying, finally being lifted. The truth was out. The lie was dead. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I told him to call the doctor. Tell them to prep for surgery. For the first time, a genuine emotion broke through his despair, not relief, not happiness, but a wave of raw, unadulterated shock. He stared at me as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had just performed an act of spiritual suicide, and in return I was handing him not just my life, but a chance at his own redemption. The mercy of it coming after so much cruelty was the final, unexpected blow. He stumbled out of the room to do as I asked, leaving me alone in the ringing silence, the victor in a war where everyone had lost. The world returned to me in fragments. First, the muted beeping of a new machine, its rhythm slower, steadier. Then a dull, aching throb in my side, a deep internal pain that was somehow clean different from the pervasive sickness that had defined me. I opened my eyes to the pale, washed-out white of a different hospital room ceiling. I was in the recovery ward. The surgery was over. I was alive. And I was carrying a piece of my brother inside me. The days that followed were a blur of sleep, pain, medication, and the quiet efficiency of nurses. My body, for the first time in years, was not actively trying to kill me. The new kidney, Caleb's kidney, had begun its work, a silent foreign laborer filtering the poison from my blood. It was a strange, unsettling intimacy. I could feel the ghost of him, a physical presence within my own flesh, a constant reminder of the price we had both paid. My mother was the first to visit. She didn't come for several days. When she finally appeared in the doorway, she looked 10 years older. The fierce, protective fire in her eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind a gray, brittle ash. She sat in the chair by my bed the same way she had 100 times before, but the space between us now felt like a vast, uncrossable canyon. We didn't speak for a long time. She just looked at me, her gaze tracing the lines of my face as if seeing me for the first time. Finally, she spoke, her voice a fragile whisper. She didn't offer excuses or justifications. She simply told me she was sorry. She said that a mother's love is supposed to be a shield, but that hers had become a blindfold. In her desperate desire to protect the future of one son, she had willingly sacrificed the other. She admitted that she had seen Caleb's potential, his brilliance as the family's best hope to escape the grinding poverty of Warren, and she had made a terrible, unforgivable choice. She had bet on the wrong son not because she loved me less, but because she saw his path as easier, more certain. She confessed that my father had never been able to forgive himself. She told me that his silence, which I had always interpreted as disappointment in me, was actually a manifestation of his own shame. He couldn't look at me without seeing his own failure as a father for allowing the lie to stand for participating in the injustice against his own child. Putting my framed picture away wasn't an act of erasure, it was an act of penance. He couldn't bear to look at the daily reminder of the dream he had allowed to be stolen. Her confession didn't heal the old wound, but it changed its shape. The pain of my father's rejection was replaced by the shared tragedy of his silent grief. She wept then, a quiet, exhausted kind of crying. They were not tears of self-pity, but tears of profound, belated understanding. I didn't offer words of comfort or forgiveness. It was too soon for that. I simply reached out and placed my hand on hers. It was enough. It was a beginning. Caleb came 2 days later. He had been discharged and was staying in a nearby hotel. He moved stiffly, his face pale from his own surgery. The arrogance was gone, stripped away completely, leaving behind a raw, vulnerable humility I had never seen in him. He didn't sit. He stood at the foot of my bed as if he didn't feel he had the right to get comfortable in my presence. He didn't rehash his confession. There was no need. Instead, he told me what had happened after he left my room that night. He had found our mother sitting in the hospital chapel, just staring into space. He sat with her in silence for over an hour before she finally turned to him and asked a single devastating question. "Who are you?" He told me that question had shattered him more than my revenge ever could. He realized that the person she had loved and admired for 15 years was a fiction he had created. He told me that his success, his firm, his perfect life in Chicago, it all felt like a hollow, set a stage for a play whose lead actor was a fraud. He had made a decision. He was putting his partnership in the firm on hold. He was selling his expensive condo. He was coming home. Not to Warren, not yet. He had rented a small apartment in Cleveland to be near the hospital, to be near us. He wasn't doing it for me, he said, or even for our mother. He was doing it for himself. He told me he had spent half his life running from the boy he was, and now he needed to figure out if there was anything left of that person worth saving. He finally looked at me, and for the first time I saw him not as my tormentor or my savior, but simply as my brother. He asked, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name, if his kidney was working. It was a simple clinical question, but it was freighted with the weight of everything between us. I told him it was. I told him the doctors were pleased. He just nodded, a wave of something, relief, pain, gratitude passing over his face. He told me he was glad. Then he turned and left, leaving me with the quiet hum of the machines and the undeniable life-sustaining presence of his sacrifice working within me. A few weeks later, I was discharged. On my last day, Mark Renshaw visited. He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was the affidavit I had instructed him to draft. He told me he had held onto it, waiting for my instructions. He asked me what I wanted to do with it. I held the papers in my hand. This was the bomb I had built, the final weapon that could still destroy what was left of Caleb's life. I thought of his face in my room, stripped of all its defenses. I thought of my mother slowly learning to see her sons as they truly were. I thought of the steady, quiet work of the new life inside me. The heat of my revenge had cooled, leaving behind a stark and lonely clarity. Burning him down now would accomplish nothing. The truth hadn't set me free, but it had balanced the scales. The debt was paid. I told Mark to shred it. The months that followed were quiet. Healing was a slow, arduous process, not just for my body, but for our fractured family. There were no grand moments of reconciliation. Instead, there were small, tentative gestures. My mother bringing me homemade soup, Caleb driving me to my follow-up appointments, the two of us sitting in a silence that was no longer hostile but simply contemplative. We learned to live with our scars, both visible and invisible. The long, pale line on my abdomen was a mirror to the one on his. They were permanent marks of our shared history, a testament to the pain we had inflicted and the brutal, bloody way we had found our way back to a kind of peace. My revenge had been a success. I had taken a dying man's last breath and used it to scream a truth that had been silenced for too long. I had forced a confession that had dismantled a family built on lies. But I learned the most profound lesson in the quiet aftermath. Revenge is a fire that consumes everything, including the person who lights it. I had gotten what I wanted, but it had cost me the simple comfort of righteous anger, leaving me with the far more complex and difficult task of living with the ashes. I had won the war, and my prize was this fragile, uncertain, and precious second chance at life, a life forever intertwined with the brother who had taken my first one and in the end had been forced to give it back.